The Windrush Generation, you know of them. But how much do you really know? As there are untold stories beyond just the typical Black History Month story of the Caribbeans coming to Britain in 1948. Think about it. You don't hear about how they rebuilt Britain's economy, and they still are till this day. As the Windrush Generation was asked to come and fill the jobs and rebuild broken Britain after World War II. These were people from the Caribbean countries that were still under colonialism. So, as you can imagine, it goes much more deeper than what you were taught. Britain's wealth is Black. The rise. You are probably wondering how. How exactly is Britain's wealth Black? Let's walk you through exactly how and why. As when the HMT Empire Windrush docked at Tilbury on June 22, 1948, Britain was not the confident empire it pretended to be. It was a nation in economic freefall. The Second World War had left Britain with more than £3.4 billion in debt, a workforce depleted by casualties, and cities still scarred by the damage. Public transport was failing, hospitals were understaffed, factories lacked skilled labor. The economy was stalling. Britain needed workers urgently, and the Caribbeans, who were still under British colonial rule during this time, became the government's most strategic labor source. Why they came? Well, they thought they were going to the motherland. The motherland myth. For decades, Britain had taught Caribbean children that the UK was their motherland. Colonial schooling painted Britain as a place of opportunity, civilization, and belonging. Caribbean soldiers had fought for Britain in both world wars. Many believed they were traveling to a country where there was work to be able to provide for their families. But the deeper truth was economic. Britain needed them badly in order to survive and maintain after World War II. The Caribbean, facing unemployment and limited opportunities under colonial rule, responded to Britain's call. And so, 492 documented passengers boarded the Empire Windrush from Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, Barbados, Bermuda, St. Lucia, Grenada, Antigua, Dominica, St. Kitts and Nevis, and British Guiana. The first wave of rebuilding a broken nation were individuals who would shape Britain's future. Sam King, a Jamaican RAF veteran who later became the first Black mayor of Southwark. Lord Kitchener, the Trinidadian calypsonian whose music captured the optimism of arrival. Norma Best, a Belizean nurse who joined the NHS in its founding year. John Richards, a Jamaican carpenter who helped rebuild post-war housing. Their arrival was not random. In 1947 and 1948, the British government and London Transport ran targeted recruitment campaigns across the Caribbean. The newly formed National Health Service, launched on July 5, 1948, urgently needed nurses. London Transport needed drivers and conductors. Factories needed skilled labor. Caribbean workers filled these gaps immediately. By the early 1950s, Caribbean nurses stabilized NHS wards that would have otherwise closed. Caribbean bus drivers and conductors kept London Transport running. Caribbean engineers, carpenters, and mechanics rebuilt infrastructure. Caribbean clerical workers supported the expanding civil service. Their wages, often £3 to £5 per week, were low, but their impact was enormous. Britain's economic recovery depended on them. Claudia Jones, the intellectual architect. In 1955, Claudia Jones, a Trinidad-born journalist and activist, arrived in Britain after being deported from the United States. She became one of the most influential figures in Black British history. She founded the West Indian Gazette in 1958, Britain's first major Black newspaper, and organized the first Caribbean Carnival in 1959. This event, created to heal racial tensions, became the foundation of Notting Hill Carnival, now one of the largest street festivals in the world and a major contributor to the UK economy. The Notting Hill Carnival generates approximately £396 million to £400 million for the London and British economy annually. This major cultural event supports around 3,000 full-time jobs and attracts over 160,000 international visitors yearly, with overall attendance estimated at over 1 million people. Claudia Jones also gave the Windrush Generation its political voice. During the 1960s and the 1980s, activism, identity, and resistance came into existence. As the first generation settled, their children entered British schools. But racism, discrimination, and police hostility created new battles. This era produced giants. Darcus Howe, who arrived in 1961, became a leading journalist, broadcaster, and civil rights activist. Olive Morris, a Jamaican-born activist, fought for housing rights and black women's liberation. The Mangrove Nine, including Darcus Howe, challenged police brutality in a landmark 1970 trial, which they won. The Race Today Collective, based in Brixton, became the intellectual center of Black British activism. The Black People's Day of Action, in 1981, mobilized 20,000 people in one of the largest black protests in British history, after the extremely sad incident that happened in New Cross, which took the lives of 13 black teenagers. This generation built the political and cultural infrastructure that continued to shape modern Black Britain. Then came the 1971 Immigration Act. The Immigration Act 1971 granted indefinite leave to remain to Commonwealth citizens already in Britain. Many Caribbean families brought relatives to join them, forming the second wave of Windrush migration. But the rise of Black Britain was not only economic and cultural, it was geopolitical. The Windrush generation entered a Britain that had never imagined black political leadership. Yet within a single generation, they began reshaping the country's civic and governmental landscape. Sam King, a Windrush passenger who helped rebuild post-war Britain, became the first black mayor of Southwark in 1983, proving that the same communities Britain once overlooked were now entering positions of authority. This local breakthrough paved the way for national transformation. In 1987, Britain elected its first wave of black MPs. Bernie Grant, whose advocacy made him one of the most influential black political figures of his era, Diane Abbott, the first black woman elected to Parliament, and Paul Boateng, who would later become the first black cabinet minister. Their rise marked the moment the Windrush legacy moved from rebuilding Britain's infrastructure to helping shape its governance. In the decades that followed, figures such as David Lammy, Don Butler, Ribeiro Addy, Florence Eshalomi, Clive Lewis, and Marvin Rees carried that legacy forward, embedding Windrush influence into modern British politics. And as Britain's black population diversified, African heritage leaders like Kemi Badenoch, Kwasi Kwarteng, and James cleverly emerged as part of the broader black British political landscape, a landscape made possible because Windrush carved out the space for black political power to exist at all. Without the Windrush generation, British music would not exist as we know it. And music is one of the most consumed products in the world, let alone just in Britain. Caribbean communities created ska, reggae, lovers rock, sound system culture, rap, jungle, garage, grime, UK drill, Afro swing. Every major British genre has Caribbean DNA. From lovers rock pioneers like Janet Kay and Carol Thompson, to grime architects like So Solid Crew, Wiley, Dizzy Rascal, and Kano, to drill innovators like Hedi One and Digga D. The Windrush legacy is the backbone of British sound. Not forgetting Slick Rick, who is also a descendant of the Windrush generation, who revolutionized hip-hop culture, not just with his storytelling but also his fashion. There is no UK rap without the influence of London Posse, PDC, Mashdown, and North Star, and they all have members that are descendants of the Windrush generation. The influence of Mike GLC also has to be mentioned. Even the UK's global music dominance, Giggs, Stormzy, Dave, J Hus, and Little Sims, comes directly from Windrush descendants. Yes, they may be of West African heritage, but there is no denying growing up in the UK that they would have some level of inspiration from direct descendants of those from the Windrush generation. Because, remember, there is no grime without Wiley and Megaman from So Solid. Both are descendants of the Windrush generation. There are so many names to mention, but you can understand that level of influence. When it comes to film, TV, in Britain, there is no modern British film culture without the Windrush generation influence. Windrush descendants shaped Top Boy, Blue Story, Kidulthood/Adulthood, Bullet Boy, Supercell, Adolescence, just to name the few. These stories exist because Caribbean communities built the environments, the culture, and the realities they portray. Media and broadcasting legends. Windrush descendants became the faces of British media. Sir Trevor MacDonald, the most respected news anchor in British history. Lenny Henry is a pioneer of British comedy and co-founder of Comic Relief. Alison Hammond, a national TV personality and the cousin of reggae legend Beres Hammond. Alicia Dixon, a major entertainment figure. Alexandra Burke, X Factor winner and now a musical theater performer. To even supermodel Naomi Campbell, who is the sibling of Richard Blackwood. Both are Black British icons who are from descendants of the Windrush generation. The contributions are astonishing when you deep the links. Their influence reshaped British entertainment. The digital era such as YouTube, Twitch, TikTok, and other streaming platforms. In the 2020s, the Windrush generation influence and also dominate digital culture. KSI, co-owner of Dagenham and Redbridge FC, global entertainer and business mogul. Chunks, Nella Rose, Nico Amalana, Beta Squad, Harry Pinero, Matisse, Expressions, Zazie Mills, The Shea Burrow, Bouncer, and so many more names to mention as the new generation of British cultural architects. They built a digital economy worth millions, influencing fashion, music, sports, and youth culture. In sports, such as the English Premier League, the Windrush generation arguably has made it one of the biggest and most popular football leagues in the world. Names like Dwight York and Andy Cole took it global when they won a treble with Manchester United in 1999. Then, the likes of Ian Wright became a cultural icon that everybody loves. Even rivals, and that includes a lot of white people. His sons and grandchildren have followed his football boots. Sean Wright Phillips, for example, has also become a cult hero himself when at Chelsea FC. Windrush descendants produced other footballers like Ian Wright, Rio Ferdinand, Raheem Sterling, Alex Scott, Drew Spence, Cole Palmer, Daniel Sturridge, Jermaine Defoe, Trent Alexander-Arnold, Micah Richards, Kyle Walker, Reece James, Lauren James. Again, just to name the few. They transformed British sport and globalized the Premier League, as well as the Women's Super League. When it comes to economics, Black Pound Day and Black British Enterprise were extremely significant. As in June 2020, Swiss of So Solid Crew launched Black Pound Day, a movement designed to strengthen Black economic ecosystems. It became one of the most influential economic initiatives in modern Black British history. Black-owned businesses, from food to fashion to tech, now contribute significantly to the UK economy. To even Krept and Conan, who have started several businesses. One notable one is Nala's Baby. This is distributed and sold in Sainsbury's, Boots, and other mainstream outlets. By April 2026, the Windrush legacy is everywhere, in Britain's hospitals, on its buses, in its music, on its screens, in its stadiums, across its digital platforms, inside its businesses, and deep within its national identity. Modern Britain is a Windrush creation. So, do you see how powerful and empowering the Windrush generation is and will always be? But with such great influence comes challenges. The challenges. You have heard some of the stories. But what you have not heard is how deep and intricate the Windrush generation built modern Britain. But their journey has never been free of obstacles. From the moment the HMT Empire Windrush arrived at Tilbury in 1948, the same nation that depended on Caribbean labor also constructed barriers that limited their progress. These challenges evolved across decades, shaping the lived reality of the Windrush generation's families from 1948 to even in April 2026. Even Black people who have migrated from African countries face the same set of challenges. Like in the 1950s and 1960s, Caribbean workers rebuilt Britain's economy while facing housing discrimination that forced many into overcrowded areas in Brixton in London, St. Paul's in Bristol, Toxteth in Liverpool, and Chapeltown in Leeds. No blacks, no Irish, no dogs signs were common, even as Caribbean workers kept the NHS, London Transport, and British industry functioning. Despite earning between £3 to £5 per week, many were denied mortgages, fair rents, and access to better neighborhoods. By the 1970s and 1980s, the children of the Windrush generation faced new challenges. Over-policing in Brixton, Toxteth, and St. Paul's led to uprisings rooted in unemployment, discrimination, and aggressive stop-and-search tactics. People like Darcus Howe, Olive Morris, and the Mangrove Nine fought these injustices, but systemic barriers persisted. Caribbean communities contributed billions in labor value, yet faced disproportionate unemployment and limited access to senior roles across public services. Even Notting Hill Carnival has had its own challenges since its inception. That deserves its own separate story. It is that deep, because how it started was due to racial tensions as well as the tragic loss to Kelso Cochran. Yet one of the greatest challenges Black Britain faced was entering a political system that was never designed with them in mind to lead. The Windrush Generation built communities, stabilized industries, and reshaped culture long before they were ever allowed near the systems of power. Even when breakthroughs came, like Sam King becoming the first Black mayor of Southwark, they came against a backdrop of institutional resistance. When Bernie Grant, Diane Abbott, and Paul Boateng entered Parliament in 1987, they walked into an environment where their presence was treated as an anomaly rather than a progression. Their challenges were not only political but structural. Navigating institutions that questioned their legitimacy, media landscapes that scrutinized their every move, and public expectations shaped by decades of exclusion. Later figures such as David Lammy, who is now the first Black Deputy Prime Minister, as well as Don Butler, Ribeiro Addy, Florence Eshalomi, Clive Lewis, and Marvin Rees, and more, inherited these same pressures: the burden of representation, the weight of community expectation, and the constant negotiation between visibility and vulnerability. And as African heritage politicians like Kemi Badenoch, Kwasi Kwarteng, and James cleverly rose to national prominence, they too entered a political arena shaped by the same historical tensions, a system still adjusting to the idea that Black leadership is not an exception, but a permanent feature of modern Britain. The 1990s and 2000s brought another layer of cultural influence, but also new forms of inequality. Black British music, from garage to grime, was often criminalized. So Solid Crew were subjected to a ban that stopped their dominance, which unfortunately led them not being able to tour properly. The 696 form made it very challenging for Black artists to perform. Giggs is a miracle because he overcame that era. Even before Giggs, Black British artists found it near impossible to secure major label backing. When the industry did open its doors to artists like Jamelia, the investment was often fleeting, resulting in careers that peaked brilliantly, but were ultimately short-lived by design. We see this cycle repeat with Alexandra Burke, whose trajectory plummeted from a historic duet with Beyoncé on The X Factor to the safe, predictable confines of musical theater. Let us not forget Choice FM. How one can say there was a hostile takeover by global radio. It is challenging to stay in existence. Then artists like Saskilla from grime collective New Brand Flex and others, including Darrotten, navigated an industry that profited from Black creativity while offering limited protection or support. After Darrotten's untimely passing, the misuse of his friend's face, Saskilla, a prominent member of New Brand Flex, highlighted how Black artists remain vulnerable to exploitation. That aside, New Brand Flex's manager, Maxwell D, is a descendant of the Windrush Generation and son of DJ Natty B, representing a lineage of cultural architects who still face structural barriers in an industry built on their contributions. In the 2010s and 2020s, new challenges emerged around economic mobility and business growth. Black-owned businesses across cities like Brixton, Leeds, Bristol, and Liverpool continued to face barriers in accessing capital, investment, and mainstream retail opportunities. Throughout the 2010s, it showed that Black entrepreneurs were less likely to secure bank loans and, when approved, often received smaller amounts with higher interest rates. This limited the ability of many Windrush descendant business owners to scale, hire staff, or expand into new markets. In response, Black Pound Day, launched in June 2020 by Swiss of So Solid Crew, became a major economic movement encouraging consumers to redirect spending into Black-owned businesses. By 2026, Black Pound Day has generated an estimated £100 million to £120 million in additional annual revenue for Black-owned companies across the UK, with participating businesses reporting significant increases in sales on each monthly event. Despite this impact, the wider challenge remains. Black-owned companies continue to receive a disproportionately low share of the UK's venture capital funding, corporate partnerships, and high street visibility, despite being high consumers of also non-Black-owned businesses. These economic barriers show how, even today, Windrush Generation descendants contribute significantly to Britain's economy while still navigating unequal access to financial opportunity. 2026, new challenges have been exposed in the digital economy. Influencers like Adeola Patron publicly highlighted the racial pay gap in brand deals, where Black creators are often offered significantly less than white counterparts for identical work. Despite dominating and influencing culture, Black British creators still face unequal access to funding, sponsorship, and mainstream opportunities, especially Black women. Across housing, employment, policing, media, and digital industries, the pattern remains consistent. Windrush Generation's descendants continue to build Britain, even as they navigate systems not built for them. As even actors have had to go to Hollywood to get more opportunities and come back and create here. Idris Elba, Damson Idris, Amil Amin, Daniel Kaluuya, Rapman, and even Delroy Lindo said he would love to work in the Britain film industry, even though he doesn't know much, as he was partly raised in Lewisham, South London. These challenges set the stage for what comes next, the fight for recognition, justice, and true economic equality. And when you think about it, these challenges also are what launched so many turning points. The turning points. If you honestly take a deep look, the story of Black Britain is not a straight line. It is a series of ruptures, moments where a community denied access to power built its own institutions, its own culture, and eventually its own economy. These turning points did not just happen in isolation. Each one created the conditions for the next, forming an ecosystem that stretches from the arrival of the HMT Empire Windrush to their descendants' arrival on digital platforms of today. The first turning point arrived in 1948, when the HMT Empire Windrush arrived at the docks in Tilbury. Britain needed labor, the Caribbean supplied it, as the Caribbeans were promised job opportunities. However, the promise of opportunities collided with the reality of racism, housing discrimination, and state hostility. Out of this tension came the first self-built institutions. Claudia Jones' Caribbean Carnival in 1959, a cultural act of resistance that would evolve into Notting Hill Carnival, the largest street festival in Europe. It adds approximately between £396 million to £400 million annually to the UK economy. In the 1970s, activists like Darcus Howe and Olive Morris confronted police brutality and institutional racism, laying the political groundwork for Black British identity, as well as justice and equality. One of the most overlooked turning points in modern British history was the moment Black political leadership moved from the margins into the center of national life. It began with local breakthroughs like Sam King at the age of 57, a Windrush passenger who became the first Black mayor of Southwark, proving that the communities who rebuilt Britain could also help govern it. But the real shift came in 1987, when Britain elected its first wave of Black MPs. Bernie Grant, whose unapologetic advocacy made him a defining voice of his era, Diane Abbott, the first Black woman in Parliament, and Paul Boateng, who would later become the first Black cabinet minister. Their election marked a structural turning point, the moment the Windrush legacy entered Westminster. In the decades that followed, figures such as David Lammy, Don Butler, Ribeiro Addy, Florence Eshalomi, Clive Lewis, and Marvin Rees expanded that influence, embedding Black British leadership into the country's political fabric. And as Britain's Black population diversified, African heritage politicians like Kemi Badenoch, Kwasi Kwarteng, and James cleverly rose to senior national roles, reflecting a broader transformation. The political space they now occupy exists because the Windrush generation forced Britain to confront who gets to lead, who gets to speak, and who gets to shape the nation's future. The next turning point emerges in the 1980s and 1990s, when representation becomes infrastructure. Val McCalla launches The Voice, with being one of the first Black people to get a loan. The loan was up to £62,000 to launch the first major Black British newspaper. In 1990, Patrick Barry and Neil Kinloch created Choice FM. Choice FM became the first licensed Black radio station. Neil Kinloch also eventually became involved with The Voice newspaper. When it comes to TV, Channel 4 aired Desmond's, and the BBC follows with The Real McCoy. These weren't just shows. They were cultural anchors, the first time Black Britain saw itself reflected with dignity and humor, outside of Lenny Henry's cameos on the BBC. Then, The millennium hits, and the cultural economy explodes. So Solid Crew, led by Mega Man, became the first black British music empire. They build Delight FM 103, pioneer independent distribution, and prove that black British music can dominate the charts without compromising your identity. Mega Man later went on to launch Cheats and Thieves Clothing. Before that, So Solid Crew had partnership with Adidas Y3 and Money Clothing. As for Lisa Mafia, she expands into fashion and beauty with House of Mafia and Salon 48. Northstar's C1 launches Bass Buds, generating over $1 million in months, one of the earliest black British consumer tech successes. Wiley creates Eskimo Dance, the live infrastructure that births grime. Lethal Bizzle turns Dench into a national brand, proving viral marketing before social media understood it. But the next turning point is technological. Channel U arrived in 2003, giving visual identity to a generation for many black British artists. Then comes online platforms such as SBTV, GRM Daily, Link Up TV, Mixtape Madness, and platforms that bypass the gatekeepers entirely. Ace and Vis moved from Channel U to BBC One Extra, marking the first major crossover of black British youth culture into national broadcasting. Then comes the entrepreneurial era. J2K, aka Jason Black, builds Crep Protect into a global sneaker care empire, then expands into HYPHNT, eHome, and ViewPay. Crep and Conan diversify into Safeway's Supermarket, Nala's Baby, Crepes and Cones, SYPS, and Smacks. Tiny Tempa builds Disturbing London. Tinchy Strider launches Star in the Hood. Big Narsty becomes a media force. M.O. Gilligan and Judy Love broke into mainstream television. Not to mention, Daniel Kaluuya became the first black British actor to win an Oscar Academy Award. Stephen Graham is also close to winning an EGOT. The list continues now that Michaela Seal is making waves. 50 Cent continues to hire black British actors. Even worked with Ashley Walters at one point before Ashley Walters became Duchesne in Top Boy. Rapman broke records not just within the UK for Shiro's Story and Blue Story, the three-part rap musical film series, but also for creating a movie, a full-feature movie Blue Story, which starred Michael Ward, who also starred in Small Axe, about the Windrush Generation. Rapman went from rapping storytelling to Supercell, a series exploring sickle cell. This is because of the success of Kiddlehood by Noel Clarke. Behind many of these moves stand two pivotal figures. On the music side, Darcus Bees, the legendary Island Records executive who signed Crep and Conan and helped shape the rise of modern black British talent. And on the business and cultural strategy side, Ricky Blue, the UK's closest equivalent to Steve Stout, an A&R, strategist, and connector whose influence threads through Crep Protect, Crepes and Cones, Safeways, Nala's Baby, and the careers of Stormzy, Dave, Crep and Conan, Ray Black, and many more. As for Darcus Bees, the son of Darcus Howe, he definitely is a turning point in human form, considering his father is a black British icon, especially when it comes to activism. The final turning points arrive in the 2020s. Swiss, from So Solid Crew launches Black Pound Day, injecting over £100 million into black businesses. Adeola Patron exposes the influencer pay gap, forcing the digital economy to confront its own inequalities. The Shea Burrow and 90s Baby Show become cultural institutions in their own right. Together, these turning points form a single truth. Black Britain did not just contribute to the nation. It built an entire parallel infrastructure, an economy, a culture, a system, a legacy. And you best believe more turning points are to happen in the near future because the streaming era with Expressions, Billy the Goat, KSI, Deji, and the merge with sports like Baller League this bridge the gap even more. Micah Richards and Ian Wright already attend and are themselves unapologetically, which leads to Cole Palmer being comfortable enough to be friends with Central C, and who knows where that can lead in the future. Let's also mention how Alex Iwobi is comfortable with making music and remaining a professional football player. So much is happening that boosts the algorithms in real life, in real time in Britain, and these turning points are proving just how influential black British people are. The strategies. Because for you to really understand how the Windrush generation rebuilt Britain's wealth, you have to understand the strategies they used. not corporate strategies, not government strategies, but survival strategies that became economic blueprints. When the HMT Empire Windrush arrived in 1948, Britain was a nation in economic crisis. The Second World War had drained its workforce, its infrastructure, and its public services. The newly created NHS was already facing tens of thousands of vacancies. London Transport was short of thousands of workers. British Rail was understaffed. Construction sites were empty. Britain needed labor, and the Caribbean supplied it. The strategy of the Windrush Generation, though unspoken, was simple. Take the jobs Britain needed most, stabilize the sectors Britain depended on, and become economically indispensable. They entered the NHS, London Transport, British Rail, construction, and manufacturing. By the 1950s, Caribbean workers formed the backbone of London's transport system and a significant portion of NHS frontline staff. This wasn't just labor, it was economic reconstruction. They rebuilt the country from the inside out. But racism, housing discrimination, and the state of hostility forced the Windrush Generation into another strategy: build what Britain refused to provide. Whereby they developed a strategy that meant work twice as hard and twice as smart. This strategy worked despite systemic racism. They still overcame. Claudia Jones launched the Caribbean Carnival in 1959, a cultural act of resistance that evolved into Notting Hill Carnival, which today contributes £396 million annually to the UK economy, supports 3,000 full-time jobs, and attracts 160,000 international tourists. Activists like Darcus Howe and Olive Morris built political strategies that confronted police brutality and institutional racism, creating legal and cultural frameworks that protected Black communities. Their strategy was clear: if Britain won't give us institutions, we will build them ourselves. They built community centers, newspapers, legal defense groups, and cultural spaces that became the backbone of Black British life. One of the most powerful strategies Black Britain developed was learning how to operate inside systems that were never designed for them. The Windrush Generation built influence through community networks, churches, trade unions, and local councils long before they were allowed into national politics. Figures like Sam King, became the first Black mayor of Southwark, showed that political power could be built from the ground up through service, visibility, and community trust. When Bernie Grant, Diane Abbott, and Paul Boateng entered Parliament in 1987, they brought with them a strategy shaped by decades of grassroots organizing: speak clearly, organize locally, and build alliances that turn community pressure into institutional change. Later leaders such as David Lammy, Don Butler, Ribeiro Addy, Florence Eshalomi, Clive Lewis, and Marvin Rees refined this approach, using policy, advocacy, and public engagement to push issues that had long been ignored. And as African heritage politicians like Kemi Badenoch, Kwasi Kwarteng, and James cleverly rose to national prominence, they demonstrated another strategic evolution, navigating the highest levels of government within a political environment shaped by the Windrush legacy. Across generations, the strategy remained consistent: build power where you can, influence what you can reach, and turn representation into leverage. In between this era, the partner system became one of the Windrush Generation's most important economic strategies, a financial technology born from exclusion. When British banks refused them loans, mortgages, or even basic credit, Caribbean migrants created their own rotating savings networks. Each member contributed a fixed amount weekly or monthly, and one person received the full lump sum in rotation. It was simple, disciplined, and built entirely on trust. But beneath the surface, it taught deeper money principles: collective risk sharing, delayed gratification, and the idea that wealth grows faster when a community moves as one. The partner system funded deposits for houses, shop fronts, business equipment, education, and even early Black British enterprises. It wasn't just a workaround. It was a quiet act of economic sovereignty, proving that when formal systems shut people out, they build systems of their own. So much so that you see it being reflected in shows like Desmond's, which that show location was in Peckham, South London. By the 1980s and 1990s, the strategy evolved into representation as infrastructure. Val McCalla launched The Voice in 1982, the first major Black British newspaper. Patrick Barry and Neil Kinloch created Choice FM, the first licensed Black radio station. Neil Kinloch later became involved with The Voice, linking media and community power. Channel 4's Desmonds and the BBC's The Real McCoy became cultural anchors. The strategy of this era was simple. Representation is economic power. If we control our stories, we control our markets. This laid the foundation for the creative industries that now contribute £123 to £126 billion annually to the UK economy. Then the millennium hit, and the cultural economy strategy took over. So Solid Crew, led by Megaman, became the first black British music empire since London Posse. Their strategy was revolutionary. Build Delight FM to control the airwaves, pioneer independent distribution to bypass labels, and expand into fashion through Adidas Y3, Money Clothing, and later his own brand, Cheats and Thieves. Ashley Walters, aka Asher D, was central to this era. After his release from prison, he starred in Bullet Boy, then moved into mainstream television with Hustle, and eventually became a cultural anchor through Top Boy and other TV shows like Adolescence with Stephen Graham, who is also a descendant of the Windrush generation and fully proud, as when accepting his BAFTA, he mentioned about his Jamaican heritage. As for Ashley Walters, his career became a blueprint for how black British artists could transition from music to film to television while maintaining cultural authenticity. Lisa Mafia expanded into Mafia Rum, House of Mafia, and Salon 48. North Star's C1 launched Bass Buds, generating over £630,000 in early sales, one of the earliest black British consumer tech wins. Wiley created Eskimo Dance, the live infrastructure that birthed grime. Lethal Bizzle turned Dench into a national brand, proving viral marketing before social media understood virality. The strategy of this era was clear: own the culture, monetize the culture, scale the culture. Then came the entrepreneurial era. J2K, Jason Black, built Crep Protect into a global sneaker care empire. The company's verified financials show £30.22 million turnover, £7.45 million gross profit, £811,686 cash, and £49 million in total assets. He then expanded into HiThinNet, eHome, and ViewPay. Krept and Conan executed one of the most sophisticated diversification strategies of their generation. They built Nala's Baby, which generated £5.5 million revenue, grew from £1.8 million to £5.5 million in a single year, secured £3 million in investment, reached a £17.5 million valuation, and achieved 8% of the UK baby toiletries market, selling over 3 million products across 400 Boots stores plus Tesco, Morrisons, Sainsbury's, Ocado, Next, and Debenhams. They launched Saveways, a 15,000 square foot supermarket in Croydon built with £1 million in investment, creating 30-plus jobs and serving black and minority communities with world foods, halal butchers, bakeries, and online delivery. They invested in SYPS, a registered UK drinks company, and expanded into hospitality with Crepes and Cones. They also became the faces of the Rap Game UK, the second longest-running black British TV show after Desmonds, creating a national talent pipeline for UK rap. Tiny Tempa built Disturbing London. Tinchy Strider launched Star in the Hood. Rapman broke into cinema with Blue Story and into streaming with Supercell, filmed in the streets of many parts of South London, the home of many black Brits. Daniel Kaluuya became the first black British actor to win an Oscar. Michaela Seal reshaped global television. The strategy of this era was diversification. Turn artists into businesses, turn businesses into ecosystems. Behind many of these moves stands Darcus Bees and Ricky Blue, whose strategies are to unify the ecosystem. Darcus Bees' father, Darcus Howe's legacy, placed him inside the industry, giving him access to labels, artists, and executives. That connect to Ricky Blue became an A&R strategist and connector whose influence threads through Crep Protect, Crepes and Cones, Saveways, Nala's Baby, and the careers of Stormzy, Dave, Krept and Conan, Ray Black, and more. His strategy was simple: build cross-industry pipelines and turn culture into capital. Darcus B's father was no doubt a black British icon who fought for equality and justice. Now in his own right has ensured that equality and justice are happening economically. This is not just a powerful strategy. This is an empowering strategy. Then, the 2020s arrived, and the strategy shifted again, this time to economic empowerment. Swiss launched Black Pound Day, injecting over £100 million into black businesses. From having an online marketplace to opening and running Black Pound Day stores, even in Westfield and Stratford and Westfield and White City, selling black-owned products. Adeola Patron exposed the influencer pay gap, forcing brands to change their pricing structures. The Shea Burrow and 90s Baby Show, the Receipt Podcast, and HC Podcast became cultural institutions. Expressions, Billy the Goat, KSI, Deji, and the Baller League created a new sports entertainment economy. Micah Richards and Ian Wright brought Black British authenticity into mainstream football broadcasting. Cole Palmer's friendship with Central C symbolized the merging of football and music cultures. Alex Iwobi showed that a Premier League footballer can make music without losing professionalism. The strategy of this era is clear. Use the algorithm as leverage, turn visibility into value, turn culture into capital, turn influence into infrastructure. Because look at what KSI has done. He has come full circle from playing football manager game to now having some ownership in Dagenham and Redbridge FC. Black British owners, whether a minority stake or major stake, are very rare. There are literally so many strategies without even going into all of them. British wealth owes it to Black British people, as, from 1948 to April 2026, the strategies of the Windrush generation and their descendants, born from necessity, became the blueprint for modern Britain. They rebuilt Britain's wealth. They still shape Britain's economy. They are still building modern Britain. So when you truly look at it all, there are lessons you can learn because it's not just about survival. What do you think those lessons are? As when you analyze the Windrush generation story through the lens of strategy, not just sentiment, a pattern emerges. People who are denied access to power often become the most skilled at understanding how power works. The Windrush generation arrived in Britain that needed their labor but resisted their presence. That contradiction forced them into a form of accelerated strategic thinking. They learned that institutions respond to pressure, not patience. They learned that economic value can shift social value. And they learned that the fastest way to become indispensable is to solve the problems a society cannot solve for itself. That is why they entered the NHS, London Transport, British Rail, and construction, not because these were easy jobs, but because these were the jobs that held the country together. Their insight was simple. If you stabilize a nation's infrastructure, you become part of its foundation. The deeper insight is this: Black political leadership in Britain did not emerge from political institutions. It emerged from the same survival logic that shaped every other part of the Windrush legacy. When the system denied access, Black communities built parallel structures of influence. Community centers, advocacy groups, cultural institutions, and local networks that became training grounds for future leaders. That is why figures like Sam King, who arrived on the HMT Empire Windrush, rose from community organizing to become the first Black mayor of Southwark. It is why Bernie Grant, Diane Abbott, and Paul Boateng entered Parliament not as anomalies, but as the political expression of decades of grassroots discipline. It is why modern leaders such as David Lammy, Don Butler, Ribeiro Addy, Florence Eshalomi, Clive Lewis, and Marvin Rees operate with a fluency that comes from generations of navigating institutions from the outside in. And it is why African heritage politicians like Kemi Badenoch, Kwasi Kwarteng, and James Cleverly now occupy senior national roles because the political space they stand in was carved out long before they arrived. The insight is simple. Black British political power did not begin in Westminster. It began in the Windrush struggle for visibility, legitimacy, and the right to shape the country they helped rebuild. Money taught them another lesson. When banks refused credit, mortgages, and business loans, they discovered that financial exclusion forces financial innovation. The partner system, rotating savings, collective deposits, and shared property purchases were not cultural quirks. They were risk management systems created in response to institutional barriers. These systems funded homes, shopfronts, and early Black British businesses long before mainstream finance acknowledged their existence. The insight is clear. When formal markets close, informal markets become engines of mobility. Identity shaped ambition in ways Britain did not anticipate. Children raised in households where excellence was a survival mechanism grew into adults who treated ambition as a duty, not an option. That psychology explains why their descendants built industries that Britain now relies on. Crep Protect's £30.22 million turnover, Nala's Baby's £5.5 million revenue, Safeway's £1 million supermarket investment, and the cultural economies built by So Solid Crew, Rapman, Tiny Tempa, and others are not isolated successes. They are the economic expression of a generational mindset. If the system won't open the door, build the building. Decision-making under pressure became a transferable skill. The same logic that helped Windrush Generation families navigate hostile housing markets in the 1950s now helps their descendants navigate algorithmic markets in the 2020s. Whether it is Swiss injecting over £100 million into black businesses through Black Pound Day, or Krept and Conan turning a baby care idea into a £17.5 million valuation, the underlying principle is the same. Read the system, identify the leverage point, and move before the market catches up. And beneath everything lies the deepest insight. Power compounds when culture and economics align. The Windrush Generation rebuilt Britain's labor force. Their children rebuilt Britain's cultural identity. Their grandchildren are rebuilding Britain's economic landscape. This is not a coincidence. It is the long-term outcome of a community that learned to convert exclusion into innovation, scarcity into discipline, and identity into strategy. They did not just rebuild Britain after the war. They built a blueprint for how marginalized people transform a nation, quietly, consistently, and permanently. So, as you can tell by now, their journey has been extremely emotional. Therefore, before you choose what lessons you will take and apply to your life and business, let's go over a recap, just so you truly feel every part of their journey that will motivate you and others around you to new heights. Because when you think about it, what they went through is impossible to ignore. Britain remembers the photographs of smiling faces on the HMT Empire Windrush, but not the quiet fear behind those smiles, the uncertainty of stepping into a country that invited their labor but questioned their existence. They walked into bomb-damaged streets, understaffed hospitals, and a transport system on the brink of collapse, and somehow, they were expected to rebuild a nation that did not yet know how to accept them. And they did it anyway, not because they were welcomed, but because they understood that survival sometimes requires becoming essential before becoming accepted. Every shift in the NHS, every night bus driven through a city that didn't always want them there, every railway repaired in the cold, these were not just jobs. They were acts of faith, acts of endurance, acts of people who believed that if they held up Britain long enough, Britain might one day hold them back. The irony is that the country they rebuilt would later question whether they belonged here at all. And yet, even in the middle of hostility, they created joy. Claudia Jones' Caribbean Carnival, born from grief, resistance, and defiance, became Notting Hill Carnival, a cultural institution that now contributes £396 million a year, supports 3,000 full-time jobs, and draws 160,000 international tourists. What began as a response to racism became one of Britain's most powerful economic engines. That is the emotional paradox. The same people Britain tried to silence built the festival that now defines London's global identity. The emotional baggage of black political leadership in Britain is deeper than titles or elections. It is the story of a people who were never meant to be seen, finally forcing a nation to look back at them. When Sam King, a man who arrived on the Empire Windrush, became the first black mayor of Southwark, it wasn't just a civic milestone. It was a moment of recognition for a generation that had spent decades being told they didn't belong. When Bernie Grant, Diane Abbott, and Paul Boateng walked into Parliament in 1987, they carried the hopes of communities who had fought for housing, dignity, and basic respect. Their presence was emotional because it represented something Britain had never acknowledged, that the children of the Windrush Generation were no longer asking to be included, they were stepping into power. And every leader who followed David Lammy, Don Butler, Ribeiro Addy, Florence Eshalomi, Clive Lewis, Marvin Rees, and even African heritage figures like Kemi Badenoch, Kwasi Kwarteng, and James Cleverly stands on the emotional foundation built by those early battles. The feeling behind their rise is simple and profound. After decades of being told to keep their heads down, Black Brits finally lifted their heads up, and Britain had to adjust its gaze. But the emotional weight of their journey is not only in what they endure, it is in what they built. When banks refused them credit, they created their own financial systems. When landlords shut their doors, they bought homes together. When institutions deny them representation, they build media, music, and cultural ecosystems that Britain now exports to the world. The same generation that was told they were temporary became the foundation of industries worth billions. The same children who watched their parents face discrimination grew into adults who created Crep Protect's £30.22 million turnover, Nala's Baby's £5.5 million revenue, Safeway's £1 million supermarket, and cultural movements that reshaped Britain's identity. And yet, beneath the numbers lies something deeper, the emotional logic of a people who refuse to disappear. Every breakthrough, from So Solid Crew rewriting British music, to Rapman filming Supercell in the same South London streets that once ignored him, then Swiss is helping inject over £100 million into black businesses via Black Pound Day, carries the weight of generations who went through economic injustice. Turn to the revolution will be economized that became undeniable. As one of the founders of black business, Rachel Corson said in interviews, the way to correct economic oppression is with economic empowerment. Swiss also said, after our fists come out the air, let's put them in our pockets. Their grandchildren now navigate algorithmic markets with the same instinct their grandparents used to navigate hostile streets. They build brands, companies, and cultural institutions with the same urgency their parents used to build community centers and newspapers. And the irony is almost poetic. The descendants of a generation once excluded from Britain's institutions now shape Britain's economy, its culture, its global image, and its future. I mean, they always have ever since the British Empire began, but that's a whole another story on its own. This is the emotional truth behind the data. The Windrush Generation did not just rebuild Britain after the World War II. They rebuilt Britain's idea of itself. They turned exclusion into innovation, scarcity into discipline, and identity into strategy. And the country that once questioned their right to belong now relies on the systems, industries, and cultural frameworks they created. Even to this day, there still is systemic racism. But still, black Brits overcome, as it's taught and passed down from generations to generations. You have to work twice as hard, get half as far, often also phrased as you have to work twice as hard to get the same as white people. So, every statistic, every strategy, and every breakthrough was built by people who were never meant to succeed here due to systemic racism. Yet they did, quietly, consistently, permanently. This is their legacy, this is their impact, this is their emotional truth. It makes you wonder, as heavy as this truth is, what is the principle behind how the Windrush Generation built modern Britain and built their wealth? The principle, as you can evidently see how much black Brits have contributed. And this isn't even half the story. Because if there is one principle that explains how the Windrush Generation rebuilt Britain's wealth and how their descendants still shape the country today, it is this. When a community is denied power, it learns to create power in the places no one is looking. That single behavior, repeated across decades, became the engine. It is that you have to work twice as hard, is the DNA of why Britain has these moments with black Brits across all sectors and all generations. It is the principle that turned NHS night shifts into national infrastructure. It is the principle that turned exclusion from banks into new financial systems. It is the principle that turned discrimination into discipline. It is the principle that turned culture into capital. It is the principle that turned identity into strategy. It is the principle that turned scarcity into innovation. Simultaneously, political power follows. If the system will not open the door, you build the door yourself. That is what the Windrush Generation did when they created community networks, cultural institutions, and local structures that eventually produced leaders like Sam King, the first black mayor of Southwark. It is the same principle that carried Bernie Grant, Diane Abbott, and Paul Boateng into Parliament in 1987, turning decades of grassroots struggle into national representation. And it is the principle that continues through modern figures such as David Lammy, Don Butler, Ribeiro Addy, Florence Eshalomi, Clive Lewis, and Marvin Rees, who operate inside institutions their parents and grandparents were once excluded from. Even African heritage leaders like Kemi Badenoch, Kwasi Kwarteng, and James cleverly stand on this principle because the political space they occupy exists only because Windrush forced Britain to expand its definition of who gets to lead. The principle is not about ideology. It is about architecture. Power is built, not granted, and the Windrush blueprint remains the foundation of Black British political life. As these are just the few names in Black British politics. And it is the principle that still shapes Britain's economy today. Because the Windrush generation were not given access to Britain's institutions, they were given access to Britain's problems. And instead of collapsing under that weight, they solved those problems so effectively that the country became dependent on their labor, their culture, their creativity, and eventually, their leadership. They stabilized the NHS. They kept London moving. They rebuilt transport, manufacturing, and construction. They created Notting Hill Carnival, now worth £396 million a year. Their descendants built Crep Protect's £30.22 million turnover, Nala's Baby's £5.5 million revenue, Safeway's £1 million supermarket, and injected over £100 million into Black businesses through Black Pound Day. But the principle did not stop with traditional industries. It evolved. When the world shifted from broadcast to broadband, from institutions to algorithms, from gatekeepers to platforms, the descendants of the Windrush generation recognized something familiar: a new system with no guaranteed access, no guaranteed fairness, and no guaranteed visibility. And once again, they built power in the blind spots. KSI is the clearest example of this evolution. A child influenced by the Windrush generation entered YouTube at a time when the British media establishment did not take online creators seriously. He turned a bedroom webcam into a global entertainment empire. He built an audience larger than most UK broadcasters. He co-founded Prime, one of the fastest-growing drinks brands in the world. He became a boxer, a musician, a businessman, and even acquired a stake in Dagenham and Redbridge FC. His rise is not an anomaly. It is the digital expression of the Windrush generation principle. When you cannot enter the system, build something so valuable that the system has to come to you. The streaming era, from YouTube to TikTok to Spotify, became the new frontier where Black British creators turned cultural instinct into economic infrastructure. The same psychology that helped their grandparents navigate hostile streets now helps them navigate algorithmic markets. The same resilience that built community centers now builds digital communities. The same innovation that created Carnival now creates global content ecosystems. And that is why their impact is permanent. Because once a community learns to create power outside the system, it eventually reshapes the system itself. That is how the children of the Windrush generation became cultural architects. That is how their grandchildren became entrepreneurs, creators, innovators, and leaders. That is how Black British influence moved from the margins to the center of Britain's economy, culture, and global identity, offline and online. So the principle is this: when you are denied access to power, you learn to generate power from nothing, and that power becomes impossible to contain. That is what the Windrush generation did. That is what their descendants still do. And that is why modern Britain, from its hospitals to its music charts, from its supermarkets to its streaming platforms, stands on foundations they built. This is the principle behind how they rebuilt Britain's wealth. This is the principle behind how they still shape Britain's economy. This is the principle behind how they still build modern Britain. So,